Hello friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and in this week's video I'm going to show you some of the kitchen work in the homestead projects that we were up to during the last week. Toward the end of this video I'm also going to be sharing with you some things that I will not be preserving ever again, and some things that I can't wait to preserve this year. So the week started out here kind of interesting. We were dealing with a lot of the smoke that came down from Canada, from the fires that are happening in Canada, and our air quality was so poor that we had to close all the windows and kind of stay inside because I tried to work in my garden and my lungs were really hurting. So that really did impact what we were able to accomplish this week. Thankfully, by the end of the week, the quality of the air had significantly improved and we were able to get back outside. But toward the beginning of the week, we kind of had to pivot and work on projects indoors. Adam was actually off work. We were doing a little staycation this week, and that did kind of put a little damper in our plans. We had big plans to do some really big outdoor projects, but we still made good use of our time. We had lots of good quality family time, spending time together indoors as a family, and I definitely had some projects on my honey-do list that Adam could help me with. The first of which was to help fix my oil pump on my freeze dryer. I've been running my freeze dryer for about 2 years straight and daily through food preservation season. And we had a tiny leak here on the oil pump, and Harvest Right was great. They sent us the parts that we needed to make the repairs, and it was really simple. They provided us with a YouTube video to watch to make sure that we were making the proper repairs. And Adam, in no time at all, was able to make that fix for me and get my freeze dryer up and ready to run just in time for me to start using it 24 hours a day, 24/7. I pretty much run my freeze dryer nonstop. So let me show you some of the ways that I used it this week. I'm going to show you some of my favorite projects that I use with my freeze dryer and some of the things that I will not be using it for this year at all. So my garden is really starting to produce, and one of the things that I have in abundance right now are zucchini. And I've mentioned in previous videos, we aren't huge zucchini fans for anything other than in baked goods. So we're working on shredding up that zucchini, and we're going to freeze dry the shredded zucchini for winter baking, along with my abundance of duck eggs. My duck eggs are rarely clean enough for me to preserve them through water glassing. So one thing that I like to do is freeze dry them. I just scramble them up and freeze dry them, and that is a great way to preserve that. The duck eggs will also be great for baking throughout the winter. So it feels really good to get this stuff put away, and it'll make meals that much more wonderful come the winter months when we don't have zucchini growing in the garden and my ducks take their laying break. Ducks typically lay an egg a day through the spring and the summer, but then come winter, they will stop laying pretty much altogether. And so I will count on these duck eggs to get us through those months where I will be missing them. Miss Grace here had asked to learn how to load it up since we were just starting it up for the first time of the growing season, and she was very happy to help me, and I was grateful to have the help. Pretty soon she'll be taking over for me. The duck eggs do take quite a while to completely dry, so this was about 24 hours later. Everything came out of the freeze dryer and I was working on packaging it up. Now, in lots of my videos from last year's food preservation season, you may have noticed that I put most of my food in glass jars and put it up on the pantry shelves just like that. And those foods lasted through the year just fine up on the shelf. There was no moisture that got into the jars and they were still perfectly usable. But what I found is that I didn't use everything that I had put up on the shelves. And if I'm going to use these for long-term storage, they really are going to last better if I put them in a mylar bag with an oxygen absorber. Then I don't have to worry about using up this food within 9 to 12 months. I can get it in the mylar, and if we have a year where we don't grow any zucchini at all, I can pull this stuff out of the mylar 2 or 3 years from now, maybe even 10 years from now, and it will still be perfectly usable. I know the thought of using mylar can be a little bit intimidating, but it really is very easy to use. You just take your freeze-dried goods and you get them into the mylar. You throw in an appropriately sized oxygen absorber for the size mylar bag that you will be using. That will prevent pests and moisture and oxygen getting in there and degrading your food as it's in the mylar. I'm getting my bags labeled here. It would have been a lot smarter for me to do this while they were not filled, but I had forgotten that step, so it worked just fine. We're going to label them up, and then, as I mentioned, put an oxygen absorber in the bag, and then we're going to seal it. So they sell sealers that you can use that are very quick and convenient to use to seal them, but something like a hair straightener like this works just fine. So oftentimes I don't want to haul out my big mylar sealer, and I just plug my hair straightener into the kitchen outlet, and it works perfectly to seal up this mylar. As I mentioned, once your mylar is sealed up, these bags of food will be good for potentially 10, 15, 20 years if they're stored in the appropriate storage conditions, which would mean, they're kept dry, they're kept in a temperature controlled environment. You just kind of take care of this stuff, and then it will last for as long as you need to. Now, we don't do a lot of backpacking and hiking and camping at this current stage of our life, but we do have friends that do, and they've come over and asked for food in mylar, and we've put it in for them, things like eggs, so that when they go hiking, they can cook up a breakfast for themselves, and it works out really conveniently for them, so it's a great way to store your food. I'll be doing the majority of my food in mylar this year, but some things, like herbs, will be going on the pantry shelves in jars. Something else that I've been getting into jars are our clean chicken eggs. I mentioned that the duck eggs needed to be freeze-dried, but we are still water glassing eggs. I have about 15 dozen preserved so far, and my goal is to have 40 dozen for winter so that I can have approximately 5 dozen eggs a week through the 8-week period that my chickens typically take their laying break. So we're still working towards that goal, and we're getting there. On to the next project of the week, and that was to harvest the rest of our garlic. In my last garden video, I told you that I had pulled the garlic from one bed just to kind of check the size, and I was pleased with the size of it. And since we had a lot of rain coming our way toward the end of this week, I thought it would be a good time to get the rest of this garlic out of the beds before it could rot if it was just sitting there, in wet beds from a long period of rain. So I had my helpers here, and one thing that I absolutely love about having these raised beds in the garden this year is that it allows my toddlers, my little ones, to really get in the garden and help without there being a huge loss of plants and crops because they're trampling in areas they're not supposed to be in. The garden set up this way has clear pathways where they're allowed to walk, and they know that they're not supposed to touch the things that are in the beds unless mom says it's okay. And it's just really worked out, on top of being, convenient in terms of planting and weed maintenance and having better soil than the clay that is in our ground. I really like that it allows my children to help me out in this way. So we have our garlic harvest here. I'm very pleased with the results. This is kind of deceptive here. This isn't really showing how much we have, but there's a lot more here than it looks like. And this will get us through the next year. We just need to cure it. So we put it in a dry place with good airflow for about 2 weeks and let it cure so that it will do better in storage. Curing it will just dry out the outer layers of that garlic bulb, and that's how you get that paper on the outside. And then this will sit in our cold root cellar for the remainder of the year, and then we'll be eating garlic up until this time next year, Lord willing. Now that my freeze dryer is empty, we need to work on filling it back up with something. Like I said, I like to keep that running pretty much 24/7. So we're harvesting some chamomile and some other herbs. We have lots of herbs growing in the garden that need to be processed right now. She is harvesting some oregano right here. Besides the chamomile and oregano, we have things like parsley, dill, sage, rosemary, just so many herbs right now that we need to work through. And if we do some cuttings now, we'll be able to get multiple cuttings throughout the growing season. The kids decided for their hard work they would get a carrot treat. I pulled these out just to check size. Our carrots still need to grow a little longer, but the kids really enjoy sitting down and having a fresh carrot. They're so sweet and tender and delicious, and that's a good treat for all of the work they did. And here's our cute little harvest that we got, our chamomile. We found some zucchini and our herbs, and we're going to bring it inside and get that in the freeze dryer like I mentioned. I don't like that freeze dryer to be sitting empty. If I have trays to be filled, we're going to get it in there and be processing food. And if we just do a little bit every day, we will process a significant amount of food throughout the whole growing season. Herbs are my number one favorite thing to freeze dry. I have been preserving herbs for a decade or more, and I used to, before we had the freeze dryer, I would either air dry them just by hanging them upside down, in a room, or I would use my dehydrator. And in both cases with those, I feel like the heat and the length of the preservation time that it takes to, dry the product, I end up with something where the flavor and the aroma of the herbs is diluted a little bit. It just isn't as strong. And then the color retention isn't as good because I don't know if it's the heat that kills it or just the fact that it's hanging in the sunshine for so long that kind of fades the color of the herb. But when you freeze dry it, the flavor is intensified, the smell is intensified, and the color remains really vibrant. So along with our herbs on this tray, I need to process the rest of these garlic scapes that I harvested several videos ago. I've tried to freeze dry whole garlic scapes before, and they do not thoroughly freeze dry. It will take you forever to get them to dry in there. And so I've had the best results if I run them through my food processor to chop them up really finely and then spread that on the freeze dryer trays. Then these will dry in the same amount of time that it takes to dry the other herbs that are a little smaller and less wet. So that is a little tip for you. If you're going to try to freeze dry your garlic scapes, do yourself a favor and chop them up first. I learned that lesson the hard way. I know a lot of people will ask, if you freeze dry something like these garlic scapes with other herbs, will the flavors and the smells transfer from the various items? And it does not, because they're frozen first before they're dried. I don't find that there's any transfer of the flavors. Everything retains its aroma and is just wonderful when it comes out of the freeze dryer. So we have our oregano, parsley, chamomile, and our 2 trays of the garlic scapes all ready to go. We're going to get these in the freeze dryer, and it is amazing how quickly herbs dry. We put these in right after dinner in the evening, and by the next morning, after breakfast, they were completely frozen. It takes about 4 hours for it to freeze, and then they dried overnight. So if you wanted to pre-freeze your items in the trays in your deep freezer before you put them in the machine, it would take even less time. It would take about 4 hours off of the process. But this is just an extremely easy way to preserve these. It's done overnight while we were sleeping, and in the morning when we woke up, everything was ready to go. So let me show you how we package that up on the next day. When we pull those trays out of the freeze dryer, you will notice that the color is exactly the same as it was going in. It's just retains that intense color in the plants. If these had been on dehydrator trays, they would have faded quite a bit. The heat would have kind of shriveled the leaves up and made them duller in color. So we can just take this stuff directly off of the trays and put them in jars. And now I know that I had mentioned I wasn't putting food in jars anymore. I was putting it in mylar, but herbs are the exception because herbs are something that I just take a little bit out and sprinkle here and there into my dishes, or maybe I grab a little bit of chamomile out to make some tea here and there. If I packaged this up in mylar, I would keep having to reseal mylar every time I wanted to get something out. So herbs are definitely the one thing that I will be putting in jars. Now, once those garlic scapes were dried, you notice that I did need to run them through the food processor one more time to powder them up because I'm going to be using these garlic scapes as a garlic powder. And it's a much milder garlic powder than when you use the cloves, but it's delicious and will add a lot to our meals along with these other herbs. The parsley smells amazing. It is just so fragrant. I use parsley a lot in our split pea soup. I also use it when I'm making broth, so that will be put to good use. And then Miss Elizabeth is just helping me label our jars. Those herbs can all look very alike when you get them up on the pantry shelf, so we want to make sure we label those. All right, all good things coming from the freeze dryer, but let me show you some things that I will not bother freeze drying this year. These are things that are left over from last year. The first thing I have here are cucumber slices. I had such an abundant cucumber harvest last year that I thought it would be great to slice up the extra cucumbers that I have. Instead of making pickles, I would just put them in slices like this, and it would be great to add to water, or I can make various sauces and things. And we really, besides having one Greek or a Mediterranean food night where we made some things out of this freeze-dried cucumber, we have not used these at all. They're complete waste sitting on the shelf. So I will not be freeze-drying cucumbers again. Another thing I will not be freeze-drying as much of this year are leafy greens like kale, spinach. Last year, every year I have an abundance of greens that I kind of don't know what to do with, and blanching and freezing them is a whole process. So I thought I'll just freeze dry them and then we can turn them into powder. We can use them in smoothies and in sauces. And I did that some throughout the year, but just not as much as I thought I would. So I have probably 10 quarts of freeze-dried greens just sitting on my shelf to be used up. I'm realizing that I do not need to preserve that this year. And if you're someone that eats a ton of smoothies, maybe it would be a good idea, but for us, that's just a waste of space. The third thing that I will not be preserving with the freeze dryer this year is tomato slices. So I preserved a lot of tomato slices like this last year, thinking that I could rehydrate them and just have tomato slices to use on things like BLTs through the winter. But they did not rehydrate well. They just kind of turned to mush. So really the only use for these is to powder them up and turn them into paste. So this is the last that I have. The rest of them I used to make paste. I had some mixed with okra here for soups, and those slices just do not rehydrate to a good texture. It's actually kind of disgusting. So don't waste your time freeze drying the slices. But the okra is amazing, and I will be preserving tons of okra. And here are some other things that I will be freeze drying a lot of. This is celery, and we had a great celery harvest last year. So what I did is I just chopped up the greens and the stalks and put them into jars like this. And these were great for soups. And whenever I made bone broth, I just sprinkled about half a quart of this. And I only have maybe a quart left of what I preserved, and I'm very pleased with that. I will just be putting it in mylar this year so it will last longer if we don't use it up in the next 12 months. But otherwise, celery is a great thing to freeze dry it. Make sure you try it because it's not really good preserved in other methods. Another great thing is sweet corn. Just like the okra, I really love the texture of this when it rehydrates. The sweet corn is actually great just to eat as a snack. It tastes delicious, like dried little sweet corn kernels. And then you can put them in soup, you can powder it down and add the sweet corn to different dishes. I'm very pleased with this, and we'll be preserving a lot more, but we'll once again be storing it in mylar so that if there's a year that we don't have sweet corn to preserve, we can save it in the mylar for future years. Another thing for sure that we will be preserving a lot of is fruit slices. This is my last jar of sliced fruit. These are peaches, and I found that my family loved it. I actually had to ration out the freeze-dried fruit last year because they would have eaten it all up in a month's time if I didn't. We liked to have the freeze-dried fruit with our popcorn on our Sunday night movie nights, and everything, peaches, watermelon, strawberries, apple slices, bananas, you name it, delicious. So I will be preserving way more of that this year. So that is basically what I was up to in terms of food preservation in the kitchen over the last week. We're just working on herbs and the little harvests of things like zucchini and garlic that we're starting to get. We're starting to get some cucumbers. One of my potato patches looks to be ready. So it's just really fun. I love food preservation season, and I'll be taking you guys along with me as I preserve up all of our goodies. And then we'll show you also how we're using those preserved goodies in some of our meals. So that is about it for this week. We're just going to finish up while the weather and the air quality is better. We're going to finish up some projects, and we'll be back next week with another video. Until then, I hope you all have a blessed week, and I hope the air quality is good wherever you are.